Okay. And then re-recording. John, we are up. Thanks for being here. Welcome to the podcast. How's it going?
Thanks for having me, Chris. Looking forward to an interesting conversation that will hopefully inspire and maybe even give some people some new tips.
Of course. Well, speaking of like giving people tips and inspiring people, before we get too far into the conversation, why don't you give a brief background or the gist of who you are and what we might be talking about and all that good stuff?
Sure. Well, I am known as the pitch whisperer. My passion is helping people figure out how to tell a story to sell themselves, to get a job, or to get promoted, or to raise money for a startup. Or I get hired a lot as a sales keynote speaker at big annual meetings for the sales teams in tech and healthcare that struggle to not just be seen as a commodity, and they have to pitch against competitors. And they come to me and they're like, "Oh, we're so tired of coming in second place." And I say, "I understand. I used to sell advertising. I used to sell tech products. Unlike the Olympics, we don't get anything in the business world for coming in second place. There's no medal. There's no, you either get it or you don't." So I have a real fascination for storytelling and how that takes people from feeling pushy and makes them magnetic and actually pulls people in. And
Sure.
The background from working for an ad agency to selling equipment to selling advertising has given me a real insight into just exactly what it is that creates that emotional connection that makes people want to buy.
So being interested in storytelling, I mean, it's one of the things that I believe that brought our ancestors together before technology and everything. It was just, everyone loved a good story, to sit around and, let's hear about it. So have you, since childhood, always just been interested in becoming a storyteller, or is it just something you fell into just over time, or how did it all start out, maybe?
Well, I was lucky enough. My, mom read me bedtime stories, and I would always like the same story read over and over again. Never got tired of it. And then when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to major in school, when I found out that advertising was an actual career, it seemed like two of my passions coming together: business and psychology, of what motivates people, what grabs their attention. It was a little bit of Hollywood's showbiz thrown into the advertising world with a jingle, or, I remember all the TV shows with their, each the show back in the day had their own song and everything. And so I really loved being immersed in the world of advertising, because you had to say, well, what is it that makes this compelling? What is it that makes it memorable?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, every ad is trying to sell you something, but the best ones, you don't feel like you're being sold something. You feel like you're going on a journey. And then I had the opportunity to work for a small ad agency in LA doing commercials for movies coming out on home video. So if you go back in time with me, Chris, when blockbusters were everywhere.
I remember.
And people were renting movies, and there was a budget to make those people go to the blockbuster and rent them.
Yes.
Or eventually buy them. And so that's really where I honed my storytelling skills. We could look at what a movie had done theatrically, commercials and things, and say, well, it didn't really do that well at the box office, but what if we change the way we edit the movie down to a different kind of story? Maybe people will want to rent it then. And so we could take a drama and make it a comedy, or vice versa, or really play up the romance, or play down the romance. It's more of an adventure, heist, or whatever you wanted to do. And that really gave me some insights into, gosh, there's a lot of different ways to tell the same story.
So what did you learn? Like, in speaking of a lot of different ways of telling a story and keeping people engaged, and, making sure that, when you start to tell a story or a pitch,
yes,
or whatever, that you keep their attention on you at all time, instead of like losing them in the first one or two. And they're like, all right, screw this guy, I want to move on.
Exactly. Well, especially when you're creating a commercial, it's only 30 seconds and some are only 15.
Of course.
You have to really make it concise. You've got to make it clear. And most importantly, you have to make it compelling. And that is part of what I teach when salespeople bring me into their team. Because if you don't make something clear and you confuse people, people aren't going to tell you they're confused. You're throwing out a bunch of acronyms or whatever. They're just going to say, I'm out. No, thanks.
Of course.
Why does it need to be concise? And here's the real secret, Chris. There's the meeting after the meeting. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a buyer or a client, and they've, interviewing 3 different people or companies, whether they're like, these are the magazines we're going to advertise in. These are, we're going to pick one of these architects to, design our new law firm, or we're going to pick this piece of equipment to use in the hospital. And they all get bids, and they all hear from, the top 3 people. It needs to be concise, because if everyone just goes in and spills facts and figures, they go, well, it all sounds the same. I guess we should go with the cheapest. But if you're the one that's told a story that is clear, concise, and compelling, they can remember a concise story and repeat it to their boss, who may not have even heard the pitches, as to why they should pick you. And if you're more expensive, the story sticks. And then finally, the compelling part, people buy emotionally and then back it up with logic. And so we need to tell stories that tug at our heartstrings to get people to want to make a change.
Yeah, just get that kind of emotional feeling from them. And that way they're feeling almost just exactly what you're saying deep inside them. And that way it's like, hey, this guy is right. I do need to make a change.
Yes.
X, Y, and Z and whatever I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of psychology that kind of goes into it.
Oh, yes, it's true. In fact, one of the joys of teaching people how to become better storytellers is when they learn how to tell a story that other people see themselves in. Because when that happens, you're not pushing information. The story is magnetic and pulling them in. And if they can actually identify with the person that you're talking about, that you helped,
yes,
then they go, oh, that sounds just like me. I need this too. And I have examples of that we can get into if you'd like.
Yeah. And before we get into it, while you're, talking about storytelling, do you think all people have the ability to be great storytellers, or is it just something that has to be, learned and trained and, listen to people like yourself?
Well, the good news is I do believe everyone has the ability to become a good storyteller. And if you already think you're a good one, there's the ability to become a great one.
Sure.
And it's unlike, athletics or Broadway show tunes, performers, or where you are, you have to go, do you have this gift, right? Yeah. To throw a football or to hit those high notes or whatever and then training on top of that. Storytelling is, as you said, we used to sit around in the days of living in caves and tell stories and around the fireplace. So it's in our DNA and it's part of the way our brain works, but there's, a good way to tell a story and a bad way. And so if you're willing to put some time and effort into learning how to be a better storyteller, it can really help you not only in your career, but also your personal life.
Yeah. I'm a fan of stand-up comedy and I've listened to their, a lot of these comedians podcasts and, the way they talk about their writing and how they, get they get a topic or a story and they revamp it in a bunch of different ways in order just to be able to deliver it, exactly correctly to the audience, so that it's not too wordy or they're not losing them in the first little bit and that it still hits home with people. But it's not one of those things that, you just find a punchline and just go after it and tell people, but it's like an art of where they sit down and they have to word it and, make it feel just right, use their expressions and emotions just to get it out. And I never thought of it in that light before until listening to the way, a couple of them explained it. I just thought it was just they thought of a cool joke and they made a kind of an exaggerated story out of whatever, a cool story, and went on with their lives, but it's a cool art form.
It's and certain words are considered funny and certain words aren't. I've been to a taping several times of watching sitcoms.
Yes.
And they will fix them on the fly if they're not getting a laugh and rewrite it right there and then. And the actors have to rememorize a new line and try it. So it is a constant honing of the craft. The same thing when you're a storyteller. And if you're trying to tell a story that has some humor, unless you're a professional comedian, that humor has really got to be worked on as well. You don't just because you think you're funny doesn't mean other people think you're funny.
Yeah, true.
But I've learned that, one of the things I talk about is, research shows that if you take a cold shower, it burns fat, fights depression, and reduces inflammation. And for me, I was sold at the concept burning fat. That's all I needed to hear. And I thought, well, I'm going to try that during the pandemic. And I actually gained weight instead of lost. But because I was thinking, I don't need to work out anymore. I'll just take 3 cold showers every day. It's just so, you're laughing, thank God. But that little story of my personal experience has several elements in it. It takes the premise of research, may not be the best way for us to make decisions alone. Maybe we need to look at some other ish stories and other factors. I worked with a professional humorist on that, and he said one of the things in comedy is if something is true, in this case, cold showers burn fat, then we ask ourselves, what else is true? And that was where we came up with the line. In fact, I've quit working out altogether, and all I do is take 3 cold showers a day. You get a second laugh, because if you're bought into the initial concept, okay, then it makes it even funnier if you take it one step further. And that's really where the art form is. And then being a little vulnerable, like I actually gained weight doing this, it makes it even worse. It's like, everyone else is losing weight doing this, but so there's all that element of, and then he even said, if you were testing that out in a stand-up comic world, you would say, what's funnier? Cold showers first, cold showers second, or cold showers third? Wow. And we both decided that saying cold showers first is the funniest way to tell that, because that's really what the punchline is that you want to keep first in their head. It had me at cold showers. I didn't care if there's other benefits. So, but that's how much goes into it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, like I said, it was mind blowing to me when I found out that how much was going into it and how long it actually takes somebody to take a bit and just work it instead of just sit down one night and go try it out. And then work it one way, then go try it out at where like an open mic night, and then find out if you are getting those laughs or not. Then go back home and really do your homework and research it again and redo it. But before we go to, I don't want to lose those examples you were talking about there just a few minutes
Sure
ago. So let's go back to that so we don't get too far.
Yep. So let's okay. So what I help people do is take a case study. That concept's been around for decades. We have testimonials, we have case studies. Even the word study sounds like homework to me. I'm already half asleep. And turn them into case stories. So instead of just throwing out a bunch of facts about, we have another client who does this and does that, and they bought this from us and boop-ba-doo, we put it into a story. So one of the medical supply tech companies came to me and they said, we have this great equipment. It makes the surgeries go 30% faster, and we're having trouble getting doctors to buy it. We don't understand. It's so logical. The problem is it's logical. Even a doctor buying a piece of equipment makes an emotional decision first.
Of course.
And so I asked a bunch of questions, and now here's the case story they tell. Imagine how happy Dr. Higgins was 6 months ago down at Long Beach Memorial. Using this equipment, he could go out to the patient's family an hour earlier than expected. And if you've ever waited for someone you love to come out of surgery, every minute feels like an hour. And he said, good news, family. The scope shows they don't have cancer. They're going to be fine.
Right.
Then the doctor turned to the rep and said, this is why I became a doctor, from moments like this. Now that rep tells that story to another doctor at another hospital who sees himself in the story and says, you know what? That's why I became a doctor. I want your equipment too. The client said, oh my gosh, that gives us chills.
Yeah.
Not only are we not telling stories, it never occurred to us to make a patient's family a character in the story. And you see what I did there to pull you in with, if you've ever waited for someone you love. And even if you haven't, you can imagine what it would feel like, or someone who had to go through that. So all of that is making that short, it's clear, it's concise, and it's compelling.
Mm-hmm.
The secret is the client, the sales rep is not the hero. The doctor is the hero, because you want other doctors to see themselves in that story.
Of course. Yeah.
And then the real elements of that, now that you've heard the story, we can break it down into the parts of what makes the good story. So the first part is the exposition. Like you're a journalist. Who, what, where, when. I tell you the doctor's name, how long ago, where it is. You got to paint that picture so we're in it with you. And then the second step is the problem. You need to describe someone's problem in a way that people care about it. The stakes are not high in the story. Nobody cares about the story.
Right.
And then the third part is the solution. In this case, the doctor says, good news, they're going to be fine. And if the story ended there, it would be okay, but it wouldn't be good. But there's the fourth part to a great story, and it's resolution. That dialogue that the doctor said to the rep, this is why I became a doctor. That's the resolution to that story. And that when you have all four parts and structure your stories in that order and make sure you have all four parts, then that's what makes people remember it, repeat it, feel something. You have to imagine the Wizard of Oz. If that ended when Dorothy got in the balloon to go back to Kansas, the end. No, she's at home. She's in bed. She's like, oh my God, there's no place like home. And you were there and you were there. That's the resolution to the Wizard of Oz. That's why it's a classic.
Is that a big mistake that people who are new into storytelling?
Yeah, they don't have a resolution.
They don't have a resolution, and they just
the story just ends with it.
Sucks. Why do we watch this?
And then scene and the patient lived. Okay, is there no moral to the story? There's no takeaway.
Yeah.
Or they make the other big mistake is they make themselves the hero instead of the client.
So
you're the Sherpa. You're like Yoda in Star Wars in the stories. You're helping that person climb Mount Everest.
Some people don't want to see themselves be the hero. Is that kind of what you're saying?
People want, if you're telling a story to a potential person who could hire you or buy from you, they want to hear a story of someone who's like them that you helped.
Right.
If you told the story, and let's pretend that I'm telling the story where the sales rep is the hero of that story. When I came to Dr. So-and-so, I convinced him to buy this equipment, and into a waiting room earlier, and just say, this is done. I've got another surgery coming up. And he, he was like, oh, okay, maybe that's why. And, don't you want one now? See, it's just like, no.
Not feeling that one exactly. Yeah.
Because the rep is making themselves the hero of the story instead of the doctor.
Yeah. Doesn't have a hard ring for me anymore. Huh. Nice. So moving on though, I mean, I know you said you worked with a couple people and how do you think, how do you stay, what word am I looking for? Stay sharp right now, even when you're telling stories and selling the pitches and stuff like that. I mean, is this something you're always kind of working on? Like we were talking about the comedian.
Oh, yes.
Are you still working with people to kind of help you keep you sharp, or what is it?
Yeah, you're like, I watch footage of myself after I've given a keynote talk. I have a coach. We're looking at, the structure of the talk, getting feedback from the audience of what's sticking, what's not sticking. Yeah. And realizing, if somebody isn't remembering something from the talk, maybe it doesn't need to stay. Maybe there's something better to put in.
Yeah.
Vice versa. If something's really resonating and people are remembering it and using it, then that really, we double down on that. I think everyone, and you want to and I also customize my keynote talks to who the audience is. So if I'm speaking to an architecture firm, I've interviewed people who are going to be in the audience and I reference them. I remember when I was speaking to Anthem Insurance, I'd interviewed some people and they said, how long have you worked in healthcare? And I said, I haven't. I've just interviewed some people, learned some acronyms and, and so people feel like, oh, this is customized for me. So then, and I teach people that you need to think of yourself like a jukebox or a playlist. And instead of different songs coming out, you have different stories available.
Sure.
So depending on the situation, I don't always tell the same stories. I tell the stories that are relevant to who I'm speaking to.
Yeah, and that's smart. And there's a good example of this. When I used to work in higher education, and I'm not going to say any names or really call anybody out, but we had a person that was pretty high up, and every time we had a huge meeting, basically a retreat and all that good stuff, that she would do the same presentation with the same stories every single time, almost word for word with the same PowerPoint and everything. And it was just, it almost became comical to a point because we would go in there betting money, like, all right, here, which part, how long is she going to get into the next part? We almost knew it word for word as good as she did. And it was just kind of like, does she just not practice anything? Does she just not care that she wants to change anything up? Does she not have any other go-to stories or go-to like
Yeah.
anything for new examples? And I mean, not to, completely shit on her, but that was just my confusion. Like, you got anything else you want to share, besides the same thing? So,
Right. God. Yeah. Now sometimes I will get hired to come back and speak again, and they'll say, be sure you tell those key story, like with the story of how you met Michael Phelps. We love that. We want to hear that story again. We consider that with a signature story. But I'm being, I was called to be the keynote speaker at a real estate company's sales meeting on how to use storytelling to, win business, get listings, all that good stuff. And now they want me to come in and give a talk to the management team on how to use storytelling to recruit top talent to come work there.
Okay.
And that is still storytelling, but it's a whole new challenge, and it requires a customization of the talk with different stories and different interviews. That's a common problem across every industry now. It's not just restaurant workers that are, there's a shortage of architects, lawyers, real estate people, and a lot of them have never had to sell. Especially if you work for a big company, people just apply to work there, and now they're having to convince people to come work, especially if you're a top producer someplace else. Those people aren't looking for a job, and you have to, figure out, and you're maybe good at selling homes, but not selling the company or yourself as a boss. So there's, the shift and all that.
When you started, I know you've been storytelling for a while, and now you're keynote speaking. And was there a time when you had almost stage fright starting out, and you were so worried about speaking in front of these big audiences, and like, oh, do I have all my material that I need, and is this going to be the way that I want to?
I vividly remember a few years back being invited to speak at the Coca-Cola Summit for their CMOs of all the quick service restaurants, is what they call them, not fast food. McDonald's, In and Out. Yeah.
Never heard of that. Okay.
Yeah. Olive Garden. And they'd put a very beautiful book together of all the speakers that were going to be speaking over the 3 days, and our backgrounds and our books. And I started looking at this thinking, I am the only speaker that didn't go to an Ivy League school like Harvard or Yale.
Ooh.
My book is not on the New York Times bestseller. And I started sweating. And I want to tell people, don't compare yourself to other people. That is the gateway drug to the imposter syndrome coming up, because it kicked in big time as I'm in my room the night before the event started. And I'm like, oh my God, the woman who hired me is going to get fired. And I was like, she's been doing her job for a while. I think she knows what she's doing. She saw something in your video that she liked. And then I had to talk myself off the ledge, Chris, by saying, when you hear a speaker, do you care where they went to school? No.
Not really.
You care how many books they sold? No. I care about how they make me feel in the moment. Okay, then let's go with that. And so, yes, there are times where you can really get off track if you let yourself start getting intimidated by it. Or you got, maybe the speaker right before you is really famous and great, and you got to follow that, right? They joke about that in entertainment all the time. Ooh, I didn't want to follow that act. That was, or comedians have to follow each other all the time. So you just do you.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you said that. Who is it? Roosevelt said comparison's a thief of joy. And just what you just said, that, imposter syndrome or even performance anxiety, you think that you're the only one who's doing it or has it, but it's really a lot of people. You're not the only one, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that,
right.
What I like to hear is this, because, when I do my CrossFit competitions and stuff like that, it's kind of, those demons kind of sneak up on me, like right the day of or the night before, like you were saying. And you're like, damn, why am I here? Why am I going to do this?
I mean, I heard Oprah, she was ending her talk show after all those years, say almost 95% of all the guests, no matter how famous or successful, after the camera stops, they go, how'd I do?
Huh.
Was I okay?
Really?
Everyone has that need for validation. There's a little bit of insecurity in all of us.
Yeah. We just don't like to say it out loud just because it's not cool to say.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you another story.
Yeah, love it.
Through a series of events that were beyond, we all set goals for ourselves typically, but sometimes life happens and a goal that wasn't even on your radar can happen. And that for me was getting interviewed by Larry King.
Nice.
I never dreamed of that. Like you dream big, but I never, I watched him as a kid on CNN and, whatever. And I'm like, someday I'm going to be on that. Larry King's going to interview me. Well, this was after his CNN days, but still, it was look at Larry King. And so I thought, okay, I better prepare. That's how I deal with nerves.
Of course.
The more prepared I am, the more confident I am. That's a great quote from Arthur Ashe, the famous tennis pro, about that. The more prepared you are, the more confident you are, and the more successful you are. So I'm like, okay, let me, read up on Larry King. And I read an excerpt from his bio of how he got his big break interviewing Frank Sinatra, and that he also did not like small talk. I was like, okay. The show was called Breakfast with Larry, and you literally had breakfast with him in Beverly Hills with some other friends of his, and then we're taken in the car with him and the co-host to his studio. And the car, so I'm sitting in the front with the driver, and he and his co-host in the back. And I mentioned to him that I really liked that story of how he got his big break interviewing Frank Sinatra. And I can share that story if you're interested. It's kind of a cool story, actually.
I'm a Frank Sinatra guy, so yeah, for sure.
And he said, oh, yeah, that was a great night. So I'm like, oh, okay. I've triggered a happy memory. He knows I've done my homework. Yeah. And we're in the car on the way there. And it's interesting being around somebody that famous and wealthy. The driver's like, is the temperature okay, Mr. King? Do you want it hotter? Do you want it colder? Is the volume of the radio okay? Because they were playing the ball game because he's into sports, or was into sports when he was alive. And so the guy who was in the back seat with him, Cal Fussman, was trying to pull me into the conversation they were having about the game. He said, John, are you into sports? And there was this moment where I just panicked and I went, I could have a choice here, be authentic or pretend. And I'm like, don't even try to pretend because these guys know everything about. And I go, not really. I have an advertising background. The joke is we watch the Super Bowl for the commercials, not the game. and they kind of laughed. So then, we pull up to the studio and there's this, reserved for Larry King with a little drawing of him with the suspenders and everything. And I said, oh my God, that's so nice. The building did that for you. And Cal pulls me aside and goes, John, he owns the building. It's like going to own network for Oprah. Okay, got it. Never mind. So, it's a little nerve wracking. And then we're on air and he's like, so John, how authentic is it when how authentic do you need to be when you tell a story? I said, oh, Larry, it's everything. And for example, if you don't know sports and someone asks you if you're into it, don't pretend you're not. Same thing with a story, right? So we had that little car ride reference.
Yeah.
And then he said, okay, well, John, what makes a good story? And I said, well, would you mind sharing that story of how you got your big break with Frank Sinatra? And there was a moment later when I was watching the tape and I thought, where did I get the nerve to ask him, answer his question with a question? But I knew it was a happy memory. And then so he tells me, well, yes, I was young. I was living in Miami. I wasn't famous. I just had a radio show. And I was friends with Jackie Gleason, who had a TV show at the time. And Jackie Gleason said to me, what's impossible in your business? And first of all, that question alone, I just love.
Sure.
And Larry King said to him, well, interviewing Frank Sinatra, his child just got, kidnapped, and the press is saying it's because of his ties to the mafia, and he's not talking to the press about it at all. And Jackie said he owes me a favor. He had laryngitis one night. I went on and did comedy. I'll ask him to come on your radio show. So, well, right. So he gets there, and the publicist is like, don't ask him about that kidnapping. No worries. 2 minutes into the show, he goes, oh, Larry, I'm so stressed out. As you know, my kid got kidnapped. And Larry's like, I didn't, to the publicist. Anyway, they got along great. So much so that Frank invited him to come hear him sing that night and bring a date to some fancy, club in Miami. Front row seats, the whole bit.
Nice.
So Larry brings this date and he's like, oh, this woman's going to think I'm really great. And Frank has him stand up and say, this guy's going to be famous someday, I predict, and all this other stuff. Anyways, everything was calmed. It was great. Larry's taking the woman back to her place, and she's like, "Oh, can you stop and get coffee?" He had no money, but this is before ATMs and a lot of credit cards. And he was the whole night will be blown if she knows I'm poor.
Right.
I don't have cash. So he goes into the store, comes back out, and she goes, "Where's the coffee?" He goes, "They couldn't change 100." So he kept the facade up, right? That he's the player like Frank Sinatra. And that is what makes that story so fun to me, is a little bit Larry King before he was rich.
Yes. Clever.
Even if you just told him, Frank Sinatra and all that, that's the ending of this. But the resolution is that little humor thing at the end. So when he told that story, I then broke it down. I'm like, here's the exposition, here's the problem, right? You're trying to impress a girl. The solution is you make up all that stuff. So that is how you can also handle your nerves sometimes.
Oh, that's excellent. That was great. That was great, John. Man. Oh, just I don't even know where to go from here. That's like you say, like that's hard to even where do we go after that? But yeah, I guess we should just I don't know. Yeah, man. I'm still on the Frank Sinatra thing, man. You blew my mind with that, man. That was awesome. I had no idea that's where it was gonna go, man.
Yeah, well, that's also part of a good story. Is there's some unexpected twists. You think of the movies you like, right?
For sure.
And that the stakes get higher and higher, and you're cheering for the hero of the story, and then, something's gonna, throw the whole thing off, and that is what makes a story or humor, is that unexpected way of getting yourself out of a situation where you're like, oh well, there goes that night.
But I mean, you mentioned Michael Phelps even a little bit earlier, so you've kind of went around with a lot of kind of really high names.
Well, I tell that story. Yeah. So there I am in LA, and Michael Phelps is not exactly walking around the streets of LA. He doesn't live in LA. And I used to be a lifeguard. So for me, meeting him was like a fantasy. But Speedo was in my sales territory in LA. And I had noticed that they were coming out with a line of sportswear.
Okay.
So I went to make a pitch to them. And I said, hey, would you like to run this in my fashion magazine? And they're like, no. We're going to run it in a fitness magazine. And usually that would be, for most salespeople, that's okay, bye, thanks. But I said 2 magic words that I teach people to have in their toolbox when you get a no or an objection. What if? When you start a sentence with what if, you start painting a picture of imagination of what's possible.
Sure.
Like, well, what if we treated the sportswear like it was high fashion? And we could have a fashion show with the models wearing the sportswear around a hotel swimming pool. And I know, Michael Phelps on your payroll during the Olympics. If you invited him, I bet we get a lot of publicity at that event. And they loved the idea so much that I got the advertising sale. But more importantly for me, as a former lifeguard, I got to meet Michael Phelps, and I have a picture of myself with him and the whole shebang.
Nice.
And I went up to him and I said, Michael, everyone says you're so famous and successful in swimming because your fins, your feet are like fins, and your heart, you have this big lung capacity. I'm guessing there's something else going on though. I go, oh yeah, John, when I was younger, my coach said to me, Michael, are you willing to work out on Sundays? Yes, coach. Great. We just got 52 more workouts in a year than everybody else. And I then thought, okay, if everyone wants to get to an Olympic level in their life or their career, I think the question for us all to ask ourselves is what Michael Phelps' coach asked him. What are you willing to do what somebody else isn't? And first of all, sometimes you have to figure out what that is. And then are you willing to do it? Because sometimes the competition hasn't even thought about it, right?
Yes.
It doesn't always mean working out harder necessarily. Certainly as an athlete, it probably does. But in business, there's other creative ways to come around to all of that. I remember working with Banana Republic, and they said, listen, we're never going to be Neiman Marcus, but we would like to elevate ourselves and redefine what luxury is. So it's not just price point. And so we came up with the concept of, what if luxury is an unexpected treat that doesn't cost you anything? Like you didn't know you needed it, but boy, if you're given it, you love it.
Sure.
And so what they did was they realized that, in their flagship stores in Rockefeller Center in New York and Union Square in San Francisco, that's where the majority of those 20% of those frequent shoppers were giving them 80% of their revenue. And they go, we need to do something to wow them. And so they said, oh, would you like to have us charge your phone while you shop? They had people there, row of phone chargers. And this is when phones were, running out of batteries all the time,
Right.
much faster than they do now. And people are like, oh my gosh, that's great. Thank you. Right? Unexpected luxury. You're charging my phone. It doesn't cost me anything. You're going to guard my phone. Here's the surprise there. Sales went up 25% during the 2-week thing. They did that because people kept shopping. They come back. They go, oh, I got another 25% before my phone's fully charged. I'll keep, and they bought more than they went in for.
Keep them in the store.
Yeah. So that's another form of using the Michael Phelps takeaway of what am I willing to do nobody else has thought about doing to be successful. So
yeah, it's a lot of thinking outside of the box, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and not only that, but you working with these big names and these big companies. I mean, who was your first one you went and made a pitch to? I mean, do you remember that? And how did it go? Because you just talked about a little bit like
right,
being told no, and like how do you deal with that? And just that, and I'm sure you just didn't come out and you just started working with Banana Republic and these big names. So
yeah, I remember going on a sales call with a boss coming in from New York to Nordstrom's up in Seattle. And the person we were supposed to meet with at 9:00 on a Monday, so we had to fly in the night before. An emergency came up that morning, and they go, "We're so sorry, the senior person isn't available, so you'll have to meet with, a junior person." Well, the publisher was livid, as if it was my fault, right?
sure.
Didn't you confirm this? I go, yes, I did on Friday. Did you not hear that an emergency happened? And so we're thrown into this little closet of a conference room, and he goes, ugh, this is it doesn't matter what you say, right? This person has no power. Just burn through this presentation fast. What a waste of time. And not exactly the best mindset to be in.
Of course.
And the room was so small, I couldn't even make out the quote that we had on one of the slides from Saks Fifth Avenue.
Oh, no.
And I thought, well, that doesn't really matter. He wants me to go through it fast anyway. And I said, and there's a nice quote from Saks, and he goes, go back. And I was like, go back. And this is in the day when the slide projectors were on the table. And in my naivete, I thought, well, if I pick the slide projector up and pull it up against my chest, that extra couple feet might be enough to pull it into focus. And it wasn't. And in fact, I slipped and this image went up on the ceiling.
Oh.
And now I'm really sweating bullets. I'm like, I'm going to be fired today. So it does not always go smoothly.
Oh.
And what I learned through that whole process is I can't reject myself.
Mm-mm.
I have one bad sales call, one bad experience. Something starts to nosedive. And instead of having a supportive boss, I had a boss that dragged me down because of his ego. And instead of saying, it's not your fault, we'll make the best. He was like beating me. So I was beating myself up and I had a boss beating myself up. Now I wouldn't let that throw me like that, but I was much younger at the time. Sure. And didn't have the experience under my belt. So I tell young people, never reject yourself, and certainly don't reject, like in school, like if you got a B or a C or God forbid a D in my house, doesn't mean you're a D person. And yet so many of us identify with the outside results. So one of the things I've really learned is if we can get off the self-esteem roller coaster,
yes,
where we don't only feel good if things are going great and bad if they're not. Because I used to be on that all the time. Oh, I made a sale. I feel good. Oh, I got to know I didn't. I feel bad about myself. I bet another rep could have gotten this sale. You start questioning yourself, your own abilities, or you start questioning the product you're selling. Oh, maybe they're right. Maybe Vanity Fair is better than W Magazine or whatever. And like, don't do that to yourself. Don't reject yourself. And the other thing is, no now doesn't mean no forever.
Sure.
Sometimes people change their mind. Budgets change. Sometimes new people come in. So that I've come up with something called the 5-5-5 to help us all deal with rejection or disappointment or betrayal or whatever comes up, right? I mean, for some people, they get cut off in traffic, they flip out, right?
Oh yeah, I like to say that on here.
I'm like, will this matter in 5 minutes?
No.
Probably not.
No.
How about 5 hours from now? How about 5 days from now? Right? You're like the movie director of your own life and you zoom out 5-5-5. And so it's much easier for people to let go of being cut off in traffic and not taking that personally and not having it ruin their whole day. But if you lose a sale or you don't get a job that you're interviewing for, whatever, you can 555 anything. And now I have companies making this part of their culture, which makes me so happy. They're like, oh, we had a big no, and we all just agreed we're going to 555 it. We're going to talk about it for the next 5 hours, and then we're going to let it go. We're not going to talk about it anymore. Because the more we talk about it, the more negativity we take to the next meeting and the next day or the next week.
I understand.
And, what I was talking about earlier with the personal impact, when my dad died 8 years ago, I wish I had this tool, Chris, because I could go to my younger self and say, you're still going to miss him 5 days from now. So you zoom out again. How about 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years from now? Oh, yeah, you'll miss him, but you won't be this sad.
Yes.
So I really love the 555 to help us all deal with that rule.
I like that rule. I never thought about it in that sense, 555, but that's one thing. Like you just say, somebody cuts you off in traffic, you can either let that ruin your day or you can just move on and know that, there's worse things that have happened in life, and I'm pretty sure you'll be okay.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I remember the 555 though, and make sure I spread that.
Good.
It makes so much sense the way you just said it. And that's usually I usually say it the way I did, but no, I like the 555. It makes so much clearer.
It's easy to remember, and then it's easy to use, and then you can start having a group of people in your world support each other with it. Like, let's 555 this, right? And if we have to 555 it again to 5 years, is even the worst breakup in the world will not have as much pain 5 years from now.
And kind of going back a little bit and just talking about, beating yourself up and with the rejection and being told no and just your boss beating you up and all that stuff. And I never wish bad on anybody or wish anybody who has to go through something, being told no or not get the job or not the sale or whatever. But I guess in a sense, do you think that, because it seems like you learned a lot from your very first time of that very first pitch at Nordstrom, and do you think a lot of people or just people in general should go through a negative situation like that so they learn about themselves and they learn about how they really are and if they're really determined to do something?
Well, I think, I've heard people say, you learn more from failure than you do from success.
Yes.
But my whole premise is we all have just lived through this pandemic, right? We don't have to seek failure out. It'll have change, disruption. It's part of life.
Of course.
And I think the ability to zoom out again and say, I might not have faced this exact situation before, but if I think of myself like a stock in a company that I'm investing in, I know my work ethic, I know my skill set, I'm going to figure something out. Like for me personally, when the pandemic hit, all live events were canceled. And as a sales keynote speaker,
that's your thing. Yeah.
Boom. And then clients are like, okay, we're going to have a virtual meeting. Can you now teach our sales team how to look and sound good and be comfortable on camera when they make sales calls? And, I had to figure out, and, how should we set up the home studio? And I'm like, well, my lights and microphone are on back order like everything was at the beginning of the pandemic. But as soon as I get that, I'll be, so I was just literally one chapter ahead of them. But that's how I, generated revenue. So I think the concept of failure, of maybe it's a lack of us not achieving a goal or just everything being disrupted, whether you lose a job or the pandemic hits and you have to figure out, all right, how am I going to handle this? And when I guest lecture at universities and, the students are so nervous about the future, am I going to get a job and what's my life going to, I'm like, this is just one of many unknowns. And that we all have to get comfortable with the unknown sometimes. Yes. Because, fearing failure doesn't help prevent it. It makes you a deer in headlights. And somebody said to me, failure is just feedback. You keep going until you get a zombie idea. So great, it won't die. So I think if we just adjust our mindset of like, failure doesn't mean I'm a failure as a person.
Yeah.
Or a dad or a friend or whatever your thing is, a boss. It's just, that's part of being human.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% with you that, you don't have to live with that failure, but it's whatever. And I agree. I think you do learn a lot from failure because it's like you said, life is all kind of unknown and you don't really know what's going to happen and how things are going to move forward day by day. But by learning about yourself and going through certain life journeys like that, you do learn, and like you decide that, hey, I can either let this beat me down, or I can make the best of it and keep pushing forward until I start, having, breakfast with Larry King or whatever. So
Yeah. Huh? Right.
but I know we're getting a little short on time here, but I want to give you a chance to kind of mention your book and in the back right there, and just I guess just so that for the audience knows, what, and kind of, I guess what was the motivation behind the book? There's a little bit of everything that we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a business fable set here in Austin where I live. So it's a little bit of a love letter to Austin.
Nice.
And it's a story about a salesperson in medical sales struggling that the old way of selling and pushing out facts and figures is just not working anymore. And he has a mentor that teaches him about storytelling. And when she shows him how to sell himself, his own story, the company story, and a case story, his career takes off. And then at the very end, there's all the different templates that people can follow to become a better storyteller themselves. And if anybody wants to sample the first chapter, I have it set up where you can get the first chapter for free. You just take out your phone and text the word pitch with a P, got to really enunciate that, to 66866. And you get the first chapter for free to see if it intrigues you enough to want to read more.
Nice. That's awesome. And just real quick, this, and I even forgot to ask you this, but I know you were talking about in the beginning or a little bit earlier in the conversation about being a lifeguard and everything. And I know you had a TEDx talk.
Yes.
It's kind of going along the same lines, right? And
yeah, it's all connected. It's called Be the Lifeguard of Your Own Life, because unlike in a hurricane, no one's going to come save you. And it was I gave that talk before the pandemic. And of course, now we've all been disrupted again. And I think we really realize we do have to be our own lifeguard and get out of our comfort zone sometimes and figure out, how am I going to do that? And if you want to prevent yourself from drowning in the sea of sameness, storytelling is your way out.
I like it. Well, John, like I said, I want to be respectful of your time, and thanks for being here. And I know you kind of plugged your book a little bit right there, but do you have anything else you want to plug, or if you want people to find you, or just anything in general? Oh,
oops, you froze there for a second.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess my internet's a little slow tonight, but like I said, what was I saying? You're a little slow. So we're a little short on time right now, or I know I want to be respectful of your time. So, and I know you kind of just plugged getting the first chapter of your book, but do you have anything else you want to plug? If people want to find you and
if you can't remember the name of my book, The Sale is in the Tail, or my name, just Google The Pitch Whisperer and all my content shows up. And I've launched a new online community for people. It's called the Superhero U, with the letter U. And it's all about helping people get confidence and figuring out their own superhero powers so that they don't become the villain in their own life, but in fact, tap into how to get more confidence and more storytelling skills. Yeah.
Well, again, John, thanks for being here. I'm glad you shared some stories with me. I really enjoyed them, and This was awesome. This was fun.
It's fun for me. Thanks, Chris.
All right. We're out here, folks. See ya.